Hello, everybody. Welcome again to another webinar. My name is Ryan, and if you could just let me know where you are from in the comments, please. I'm currently just quite close to London in the UK. It's a bit of a grey day today. I think the summer is definitely over, but let me know where you are, guys. So, something about me, I've been teaching for around 17 years. I've taught in a few different countries in Europe and Poland and other places, and I've taught people from all over the world. And it's great to be with you here today. So let's see who we got. We've got Sarah from the UK, Helene from Cape Town in South Africa. That's great. Never Again, I like the name Never Again from the USA. We've got Nika from Slovenia. Fantastic. Uh, Eliane from Brazil, fantastic. Minna from Egypt. Judy from Grenada, fantastic. Portia from Zimbabwe. So really good mix today. That's fantastic. Okay, let's get straight into it. Today we're going to be talking about teaching one-to-one, which is a fantastic way to teach. Just let me know how many of you have been teaching or taught one-to-one in the past. What kind of experience you've had. Just drop me a comment, please. So yeah, we're going to talk about some of the things involved in one-to-one teaching. It can be quite challenging sometimes, but it has its own rewards, as we'll find out later. A couple of things to think about when teaching one-to-one is that it's obviously much more focused on you and the student. Resources are a little bit more difficult to come by for one-to-one teaching. There's lots of resources out there for classroom teaching, but one-to-one, they're out there, but they're a bit more difficult to find sometimes, and you might have to even develop your own teaching materials. So we're going to get into it. We're going to look at some of the things that you should keep in mind when teaching one-to-one. So if you've got questions, we're going to have a Q&A as usual later on. So if you've got any questions, keep those in mind and drop them into the comments a bit later on so I can see them properly in the Q&A session. And I'm here to answer any questions you've got. If you've got any technical questions or questions about the course that are not really part of today's subjects, drop them to your support teacher in a ticket. Create a ticket, and those technical or more specific course questions can be answered. Today is all about specific topic of one-to-one teaching. Okay, so let's see how many of you have had some experience of one-to-one teaching. So let's see. Alison's just doing her course in Texas, Houston, Texas. Charlotte, no teaching experience teaching TEFL so far. Okay, so you're here to pick up some good pointers then. That's great. Sarah done some PGCE primary education. Okay, so she's had a little bit of experience. Sarah, you've had some experience teaching one-to-one. That's good. Judy, have taught one-to-one. It was quite enjoyable since students grasp content quicker. Yeah, because there's that one-to-one focus, that personal attention you can give to the student. Let's see who else. Deborah's done lots of one-to-one. I hope you enjoyed that, Deborah. Nikki from New York has also taught one-to-one. And Never Again. I don't have experience teaching, but right now I'm teaching Spanish to one of the kids I take care of. Okay, yeah, it's a good experience to get. As I think I mentioned in one of the previous webinars, is that if you haven't had any teaching experience, you can generate your own experience to put on your CV. Friends of family, people in the neighborhood, in your community, you can get lots of experiences there. One-to-one teaching included as well. Okay, well, that's great. Let's crack on. So let me just share the slide for you guys. Okay, so let's get on. Let's talk about the things that we're going to be mentioning today. So we're going to talk about the differences between one-to-one teaching and classroom teaching, because there are some significant differences. There are a lot of similarities as well, but it is a different animal. It's a different breed of teaching. We'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages or challenges, I would rather say, that can be involved in one-to-one teaching. We'll go on and talk about some approaches and different methodologies that you can use when teaching on a one-to-one basis. And then we'll summarize everything that we talked about and we'll answer some of your questions as well. Okay, let's get into it. So, work, why do people like to have one-to-one lessons? So, and who is your private student? How do we get private students? Okay, so people like to study one-to-one. They've got lots of specific reasons for doing so. Um, they might be studying as part of a group in a school, for example, but they want some extra tuition, perhaps. Um, they might be working or studying and they want some specific work with that. They want might be some added business English experience or tuition. They might want to learn one-to-one because it fits in with their schedule much easier, um, so that they can work around their work or work around their studies. Um, they might just prefer to learn that way without the sometimes the distractions of waiting for other students and being in a classroom setting. So they might just prefer that might be their style of learning to learn on a one-to-one basis. It might be more efficient in their eyes. So there's lots of different reasons why uh, people learn one-to-one. So private students, how do we get private students? Well, I think if you remember, we mentioned a few of these things when we were in our teaching online webinar. So a way to do that is to advertise using social media. So if we're working for a language school, it's not a good idea. It's not really allowed to kind of poach students from the language school that we're working for. So we definitely want to avoid that. We want to find out and source our own students away from the language school. Um, so one of the other ways to do that is using social media, advertise on Gumtree and places like that. We can use Facebook and Instagram, our own websites, as we've discussed. Word of mouth as well. Once you've got a couple of students, they'll start passing on the word to their colleagues and their friends. And then you can start to build up your client base. Um, Also, of course, we could look on the teaching academy, the TEFL Academy's job board. Um, there are lots of other places online where you can look at, and you can find one-to-one work in that way as well. Okay, so let's think about some of the differences between one-to-one teaching and mm, teaching in a classroom setting. So we need to think about the difference in kind of managing the classroom or managing the setting your environment. So when you're teaching one-to-one, you don't have to think about how you want to set your class out, but you might want to think about how you set up your kind of your teaching environment. So, for example, one-to-one, I personally think it's not a good idea to be facing your student face to face. It's a bit intimidating sometimes, and it's a bit kind of too focused. I would kind of think about angling your seat or sitting in the side of the desk, um, being a bit more informal, perhaps, to kind of to make your student feel a bit more comfortable. Also, we need to think about the materials as well. So we can adapt different materials when we're teaching one-to-one. We can use the materials that are out there for teaching in the classroom, um, and we can adapt those to one-to-one settings. So we could, obviously we need to take out the pair work and group work aspects of that classroom teaching and make it much more focused on our one-to-one student. We can use our students' own materials as well. If they're in a work setting, they can take in their work emails if it's not too sensitive to do so. They can take materials from work literature, books, and advertising materials, the firm's website, for example, and you can use the students' own materials to help them very specifically. Um, we need to think also about the timing of a one-to-one. So this is largely dictated by learner needs when you think about it, isn't it? So the student kind of sets the pace in many ways, and if they want to focus on one area, they've got the luxury of doing so without thinking about the other students in the class. You can be flexible. You can work around your student's schedule. Um, and also when it comes to roles, like it's the different teacher roles, we've got kind of a knowledge base, we've got a resource center, and so on. So we can really make ourselves used as a resource for our one-to-one student. We'll talk a little bit more about possible teacher roles a bit later on as well. Um, so we can think about the methodologies as well. So obviously we can look at different methodologies and approaches to teaching, communicative and so on, and all of the other aspects of teaching, and we can kind of select the ones that we think will work best with our one-to-one student. What really work and makes them tick. Um, One-to-one teaching is very intense, as you might expect, or it can be quite intense. There's more intimacy, more intensity involved. Um, it's a more active thing for both the learner and the teacher. You're kind of always on to a certain extent. But that's not to say that you shouldn't kind of embrace silence. Don't be afraid of silence from time to time at certain parts of your lesson. You can be strategic about that. Your learner needs time to think about some things sometimes, or do a task, or complete some activity. So don't be afraid of some silence. Lastly, we should think about motivation. Why is your student learning English? Get to the heart of why they want to have one-to-one lessons with you. What's the ultimate goal that they're thinking about? Is it to get a promotion at work? Is it because they're moving to an English speaking country? Is it for studies? Why are they studying? What's their goal after they've achieved their study? Is it for IELTS or an exam or a Cambridge exam or something like that? So why are they kind of invested? What's their intrinsic motivation for learning English with you? You can really get to the heart of that and focus on your one-to-one student. Let's talk about some of the advantages to one-to-one teaching. Well, the most obvious one is that your student can get your undivided attention. You don't have to divide your time and involve everyone else in a large class. For example, you can really home in and zero in on your students' needs. You can build up a real dialogue with them. You can get the communication flowing, and really give your attention. You can also There's more control about the direction, in the way that you want your lesson to go to a certain extent. You can pick up on your students' needs and your students' motivations, but there's certainly a lot more autonomy involved when you're teaching one-to-one for both the teacher and the student. Um, you can build up a really good rapport with your learners in a one-to-one context, and build a relationship with them. It's much more intimate, but in a, you can build up a really good professional working relationship with with your learners, with your students. You can really zero in, as I said, in their needs. What do they need English for? Why are they having a one-to-one lesson with you? You can really make these lessons very bespoke, individual, and the last on the list there is about your own independence and the learner's independence and your own compensation. In other words, you can set your own prices and set your own times, for example. So these are some of the advantages of working one to one if you are going out and finding your own students. And we'll talk a bit more later on, if we have time, about how to set your prices. So many more advantages that we don't have time to talk about today. There are many advantages of teaching one to one. It's very rewarding, but there are certain challenges as well. If you haven't taught one to one before, it can be quite daunting, I think, if you haven't had that experience, because you've got a bit of luxury of letting your students take the focus. If you've got a group setting, the focus is much more on you in a one-to-one setting. So there's not that group dynamic for you to work around. What else we need to think about is the rapport, as we mentioned. So if you're very good and very lucky and you've got a good match with your student, you can build up a really good working relationship. But sometimes you just won't kind of gel that well. And, it happens sometimes that you don't kind of make a good fit with your students one to one, and it doesn't kind of feel right on one side or the other. So you can have a kind of a bit of lacking in rapport in that respect. So, hopefully that won't happen, but it's something to think about. Also, we've mentioned to source materials. So, when teaching one to one, we need to kind of think about and adapt our materials as well. It can be difficult to find more specific materials for your lessons for teaching one to one. It's out there, you can find it. There are dedicated places on the internet, and there are books out there that are all about teaching one to one that you can find very helpful. But you might need to source your own materials and adapt and make them really fit your lessons yourself. We should mention about these boundaries as well. So even if we've got a really good rapport with our one-to-one learners, uh, we want to be the old adage is we want to be friendly, but not necessarily friends with our students. So sometimes these boundaries that we can sail quite close to the edge of these boundaries with our learners. There's nothing wrong with becoming friends with your one-to-one learners in the very long run, but I think you need to have a professional boundary sometimes, and not be their counselor sometimes, or their someone that you can listen to their daily problems that can happen sometimes with one-to-one teaching. So we want to be aware and just cognizant of those boundaries. And as I mentioned, sometimes if we haven't had that experience of teaching one-to-one, we might lack a bit of confidence in that. So it's something to think about. We can build up that confidence, and hopefully you'll get some good pointers from today's webinar about how to do that if you haven't taught one-to-one before. Okay, so let's go on and talk about some approaches to one-to-one teaching. First of all, we need to think about a student's level. So before we start, we need to check the level of our students. So there are lots of great placement tests out there. We can find them online. We need to gauge the level of our students. We can use the CFFR guidelines out there, the framework. Are they in the intermediate? Are they pre-intermediate? Are they advanced? Sometimes it's difficult to gauge the level of your students. It's not an exact science. We need to adjust and adapt that sometimes, and Sometimes we get that wrong and we have to come back and change that. If material is not challenging enough or too challenging, we can adjust that as we go along. Also, it's very, very important to do some needs analysis with your students in the beginning to find out why they are learning. Are there specific strengths that they have or weaknesses that they want to improve? Um, this could be a flexible process. Um, they might need to work on certain grammar points or build up their vocabulary, or there might be some specific kind of language that they need for their work or for their studies to pass an exam. So we need to do a needs analysis. Um, Obviously, we can really tailor make our lessons for our one-to-one students. We can make bespoke lessons for them. Um, we can use their own materials. We can use authentic materials from their workplace, for example. We can zero in on parts of exams that they're struggling with, for example, or if they've got a certain goal in IELTS, they want to achieve a certain level in IELTS, for example, in the IELTS exam. We can really make this a very, very unique and tailor-made experience for our learners. Also, I think we should think about our students' interests. What is interesting for them? What do they do in their spare time? What do they find enjoyable? How do they relax? What kind of films and media do they like? What kind of reading do they do? And we can build that into our tailor-made lessons. So lastly, obviously, if we're teaching one-to-one and teaching online, quite and especially as well, it's a very visual kind of medium, um, and that's the same if we're teaching across the desk in a one-to-one setting. We want lots of nice visual um, learning materials. So images, graphs, charts, maps, videos, pictures, photography, that kind of thing really kind of stimulates your learner, and it kind of opens up things that they might have seen before. They might be in their mental kind of map of the language, and that might kind of you might kind of want to elicit things that they already know and bring those out in your lessons. Okay, so we can think about kind of the authentic materials as well. As we've mentioned, that there are lots out there on the internet to explore, different websites, YouTube videos, films, and so on, and songs are very, very interesting to make lessons out. News articles, magazines. Find out what your student likes. So, authentic material, this can be things that are generated from their work as well. This is also authentic materials. Um, Certain literature, PowerPoints that they might want to work on, for example. Um, we also need to consider giving very detailed and focused feedback in our one-to-one lessons. So what we can do is, as we're going along, as we usually do in our lessons in the classroom environment, is to make notes as we go along for delayed correction at the end of a lesson, perhaps, or in the next lesson. So it's important to also think about the areas where your student needs to improve. Um, Sometimes in a one-to-one setting, it can turn into a kind of conversation. So we shouldn't forget the fact that we need to give feedback to our students as well. Make time for feedback. And also good use of language as well. When we're giving feedback, we want to give positive feedback as well. So great uses of vocabulary, good grammar use, for example, and so on. So you can build that into your feedback sessions. We can't forget about homework, of course. So very important. Even more important, I think, for your student in a one-to-one setting, because a lot of the onus is on them for their own learning. They're more autonomous. They're more responsible for their learning, perhaps, in a one-to-one setting. So we can use homework. We set interesting homework tasks. We can flip the classroom, as we'll talk about a bit later on, maybe if we have time. So setting things outside the classroom for reading activities, for some grammar exercises, but you can use the time in your one-to-one class to actually really focus and talk about the homework together and give the feedback then, rather than marking it and giving it back as you would do in the classroom. Okay, so those are some of the things that you can think about when it comes to um, how to set about your one-to-one lessons. Just with homework as well. So um, many people like to use the one-to-one to develop their fluency. It's very important. One of the number one reasons why students want to have one-to-one lessons with a native level teacher is to practice their fluency in their speaking. Very important. But we can't forget to build a little bit of homework into that and check their grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation, all the other things that go along with that as well. We want to improve their accuracy, cut down on the errors. So we want to really pick up on these errors in the classroom. So as I mentioned about flipping the classroom, so we can flip the classroom. So we can we can set activities that would normally be done sometimes in the classroom, but we can give those for homework. So we can give those to our one-to-one students in preparation for the next lesson. So we can send them away. We can say, go read this text that I've got for you. There are some activities to go with that, or watch that video, listen to that song or that podcast. And then you can come in and talk about that in your lesson time, rather than taking up time in your lesson doing the activity. You can use the class, their students' time, which is much more flexible outside the lesson time. We need to let our students speak during the lesson. This is another tip for you to think about in your one-to-one teaching. Let them speak. So let them practice their fluency. They really want to practice their fluency, but try to kind of guide them along with that process. Make it relevant to their learning, rather than kind of get into the small talk of things, which it can be a danger in one-to-one. Because if you do build up the good rapport with your student, you kind of go off course a little bit from time to time, perhaps. So you want to kind of refocus and get your student back on track with that. Let's talk about the pricing, as I mentioned before. So we can set our own pricing with our own students. If you're starting out and you don't have much experience, think about how you're going to set your pricing. It may be start on the lower end of things when you're building up your confidence and building up your skills as a teacher, but at the same time, don't undersell yourself. Think about what your time is valued at. Think about what the students might be paying for a one-to-one lesson in a language school. One-to-one is going to be more expensive than being in a group, but you don't want to price yourself out of the market, or you don't want to undersell yourself as well. So have a think about that. We need to be aware about cancellations as well. So if we're giving cancellations, we need to be clear about our cancellation policy from the beginning. Okay, so we need to lay that out so that our students are aware of the consequences for missing a lesson or cancelling at the last minute, because we've done all the work, we've prepared this great lesson for them, but they just haven't turned up for their lesson. So that needs to be communicated to your students, because it's your time, and we want to avoid working and giving away our time for nothing, basically. So make sure your cancellation is clear. What we might want to do is to create bundles for our students. So we might want to sell lessons by the 5 or by the 10, for example, and we might give a discount for this that's a little bit cheaper than just booking one lesson. And if we've done that our students might pay in advance for a bundle of lessons, and that can kind of mitigate to a certain extent um, last minute cancellations and so on. They've already paid for their lesson. They're actually more likely to turn up for their lesson as well. Okay, so think about how you're going to sell your lessons, how to set your cancellation policy, um, and make this a great experience for yourself and for your learners, of course. Okay, so we talked a lot about a lot of different things here today. Um, we talked about how to find the private lessons. So just to recap, we could use advertising, we can use Gumtree, social media, some websites that you can put yourself on and upload a video of yourself and introduce yourself and so on. Um, and we can use word of mouth. Once we've got a few students under our belt, they will hopefully spread the word. What you might want to do is offer incentives for your students to make recommendations for you, so you can give those students a discount if they find new students for you. Um, we also talked about some of the differences between teaching one-to-one and teaching in the classroom. So there are different methodologies, different classroom management techniques, different teaching dynamic. There is no pair work, there's no group work involved. It's much more focused. There's much more emphasis and kind of the spotlight is on you and your student much more than in a group setting. So think about that. Think about how to source your materials as well. So there's lots of materials out there for you to use. We can adapt those and use those for one-to-one teaching. We can use the students' own authentic materials from their work or from their study. We can use things that they're interested in, things that they're into, their own entertainments that they like, their own reading habits. And we need to make this relevant for our student as well. So we talked about the advantages. We can set our own pace, our own timing. We can work around our students' time as well and our students' needs. We make a needs analysis for our students. We work around that. We make that the framework for our course structures if we're making a course of lessons for them. Um, we can make it tailor-made for our students very much so. We can really focus and home in, zero in on their needs to make it really relevant for them. We talked about some challenges as well for one-to-one teaching. If you haven't had experience, it can be quite daunting sometimes. It's a little bit different than walking into a classroom and monitoring your students. They're working together. The focus is much more on you. It's a little bit trickier to find materials and so on. We have to sometimes deal with not building the perfect rapport with our students as well. Um, we need to kind of embrace the fact that there are going to be it's quite intense and not necessarily the silent pauses that we need sometime in our lessons. So we need to think about also a cancellation policy and the kind of the bread and butter mechanical things about teaching one-to-one as well, and setting up our own way to get students as well. We also talked about different approaches, different methodologies out there, things to consider. So thinking about the materials as well, all of the small differences and nuances between one-to-one teaching as well. But the thing I think I'd like you to take away from this, if nothing else, is that one-to-one teaching is so rewarding. It really is. It's really an interesting aspect of teaching. If you haven't tried it, try it out. Um, it's a big part of teaching. It's not just about teaching classes. Teaching one-to-one could be with a whole range of different people, from young learners, adult learners, beginners, advanced, and you'll have a lot of fun teaching one-to-one. I guarantee it. Okay, so I think if there are any questions now, I think what we're going to do is move on to a Q&A part of the webinar. So start thinking and typing out your questions in the chat. Um, have you got any queries about any of the things that we talked about today about one-to-one teaching? Let me just read out some of the comments that we've got here from our audience today. So Sarah says, I would use pictures and corresponding words for the little boy I helped, and I tried to get him to repeat the word after me. Yeah, this is, pronunciation drills just as important in one-to-one teaching. Remember the MFP. I'm sure you don't need me to remind you what that is at this stage by now. So all of these aspects are very important. Um, Helene says, any advice on the payment method? I do I first teach a lesson and then charge for the session, or do I request payment in advance? Well, I would definitely recommend setting up advance payment for your lesson. And as I've mentioned, to think about batching or creating a bundle for your lessons, a group of 5 lessons or 10 lessons, and your student can pay upfront and in advance. When it comes to the payment method, there are lots of ways out there. PayPal, for example, or direct bank transfer. Depends how you've set yourself up. If it's just across from the table, could be different payment arrangements as well. But if you go back and think about some of the things that I talked about in setting up for teaching online, you need to think about how you kind of set up your kind of business of teaching it as well. So payment methods, yeah. For example, PayPal is very popular way of doing that. I should mention about setting free lessons in the beginning. Sure, you could do something like that, but I wouldn't make it a full-on lesson. I would make it a sample lesson, maybe a shorter lesson, maybe a 15 or 20-minute session to give your potential students, a taste of what they might expect in a full lesson. And once they're happy with their sample lesson, you can set up, hey, I'll give you a discount for if you book 5 or 10 lessons, and then you can go ahead from there. But it's a really good question. Thank you for that. Again, let's just stick with the pricing here. What pricing would you recommend charging for a one-to-one class if it's your first time facilitating a lesson of this kind? Okay, well, I think you need to think about what that time is worth to you, what the kind of market rate is out there, what your level of experience is. If it's your first time, you might to be a bit more conservative in your pricing structure, and kind of be a bit more realistic about your pricing. And then as you gain experience, you can slowly raise that as well. Have a look at what's out there. Ask around, see what other people are charging, and then you can see your kind of place in the market for that. That's what I would do. But as I mentioned again, don't undersell yourself. Think about what your value is, what your worth is. Um, don't You'll need to find the Goldilocks price, not too big, not too small, just right, I think, for you. Do you have any timeline and activity templates you can share? Do we try to have a speaking, reading, writing, and listening in every lesson? I think you need to cover the integrated skills in a one-to-one lesson, just the same as in a group environment. Templates, yeah, you can find templates out there for one-to-one lessons, definitely. I think a lot of lessons out there can be easily adapted for one-to-one teaching as well. And then you can work around those templates or these frameworks and tailor make it in a bespoke way for your students out there. so you can really fit in what they need for their lesson. But it's a lot of speaking, yes, of course, that's what your student might want to focus on, but we can't neglect the reading, writing, and listening as well. As I've said, with the reading and the writing, and maybe perhaps listening, you can flip that and ask your students to do that in their time away from your time in the one-to-one session, and you can come back later and talk about that after in the next session. Good question. Thank you, Nikki. Alison says, can you specify the age of the students you want to teach one-to-one? Would this affect the price of your lessons? Well, the short answer is yes. If that's what you want to do, if you only want to teach young learners, or you only want to teach adults, or you only want to teach business English, that's up to you at the end of the day. But I would say the wider you the wider you cast your net, the more likely is that you're going to get more students, isn't it? I think that's worth saying. But by all means, if you want to specify the age of your students, do so. If that's your speciality, if you're very good and you become specialized at teaching young learners, for example, then you might want to focus. That might be your niche going forward, and you might want to set your price accordingly because of your speciality and your technique in that particular field. Very good question. This is about cancellation policy. Thanks for your question. What would be a fair cancellation policy, as most of my students are adults and sometimes due to work they have to cancel classes a lot? Yeah, exactly. So I think obviously, you could be flexible with this. If you've got a very good student that's very reliable usually, and they've cancelled at the last minute, you say, yeah, don't worry about it this time. I know that you'll be back next time. But I think you do need to make your potential students aware about your cancellation policy, um, because we definitely don't want our lessons to be cancelled at the last minute. It's very frustrating and it's not fair. So, for example, it might be 24 hours cancellation policy. It might be a certain number of hours cancellation policy. I think 24 hours is fair, because then you've got a whole day to find another student for that slot that you've put aside for your cancelled student. I think that's entirely fair. Um, of course, if we're teaching adults, their life gets in the way, and we need to be aware of that. But it's up to your student to be aware of the cancellation policy, entice them, and make them aware that you want them to turn up for their lessons. And if they don't, well, there are consequences for that if they do it more often. But you can be flexible with that as well. This is an interesting question from Deborah. How do we find an EFL mentor? Well, I'm sure there are other people on your course that are a bit more advanced than you. They can be there to help out. Um, if you are working in a school environment, if we're talking about one-to-one teaching as well, that's good, always good to ask a more experienced teacher about what their experience is and ask them for their tips and tricks, and their advice about that. Um, but that's a very good question. I wish that I had a bit more of a mentor when I was starting out. So I think it's good to speak to other people in your networks, in your community, people on the chat today. You might want to um, hook, connect with them and find out if they've got any advice for you. Reach out on the internet if you're part of groups. I think you'll find someone who can really help you out. So here's Nika with a question about an older lady who she's teaching. I'm teaching an older lady who's just generally interested in learning the language. Her level is intermediate. I'm finding it hard to think about topics to cover. Do I just ask her what she likes? Yeah, why not? Find out what she's interested in, and, and then she'd be perhaps more engaged in that. And you're also getting her to help generate material for her own lessons. Um, Absolutely, yeah. what you might do is part of the needs analysis stage is to ask your students what they're interested in, what things they like doing outside of study, outside of work. And then you can use that to generate materials and lesson content. Go ahead, ask her what she likes. Why not? And then at the opposite end of the age scale, we've got a question about young learners here. How to motivate a young learner if her parents force her to learn English and she finds it boring? Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is true in other teaching mm, settings as well, other teaching contexts. So it can be difficult to motivate young learners and teenagers, but I think the key again is to find out what they are interested in. Um, as long as I think the parents need to work with us to a certain extent. We need to concentrate on the things that are important for making progress as a learner, but also we need to make it enjoyable. If the student's not enjoying themselves or is not engaged in their learning is going to be very difficult to take place, in my opinion. I think you need to make it enjoyable just as much as you need to think about the content as well. So yeah, make it engaging. Visual materials, videos, songs, and movies, anything that you can find that really motivates your students. Sonia says, I'm a first time teacher. Is one to one better than a group? Ah, well, I wouldn't say it's better or worse. It's just different. Um, you'll find out once you start teaching a group and teaching one to one, the differences are quite apparent there. I wouldn't say teaching one to one is better or worse. It's just different, and it's got its own rewards and its own challenges, as we talked about today. Um, but I don't know. Maybe you prefer one to the other. Maybe you think, "Wow, I really like this connection that I'm making with my student on a one-to-one basis," and you might prefer that as an individual to teaching in a classroom. You might prefer teaching adults in a one-to-one because then you can cover a lot of ground with them. They're very motivated learners, but I think it depends. You might think, oh my god, one-to-one teaching is not quite for me. I much prefer having a group dynamic. So I think there's no answer to that question. Thanks for the comment and the question there, Sonia. Really good. Um, here's a question about best practice. Is it good practice to have the student do a midterm and final test in a one-to-one setting? Yeah, well, assessment is just very important as well as it is in the classroom. We need to assess our students' progress. So it could be after a certain unit in our course. It could be in the middle of their course, certainly at the end of their course. So it could be a cumulative testing. You might want to test for certain skills along the way. Your student might expect to be tested and assessed as well. They might ask for that specifically. This is all about giving feedback as well, so giving continuous assessment. So I think it is definitely a good practice to build that into your course and your lessons as well. And you can discuss that in the needs analysis section before you start with your one-to-one students as well. You can work out, you can negotiate timings for different tests or assessments, and you can build that into your teaching. Let's see. It's a question from Natalia. What topic would you suggest for your first one-to-one lesson if you haven't found out the level of your student? All right, okay, that's a really good question. So if you have, I think you're going to have some communication if it's not an actual placement test or diagnostic test with your student before your first lesson, you're going to have some interaction with them and you can gauge their kind of rough level and you can select material for that. And then if it's not quite right, you can come back and adjust that later for subsequent lessons. um, But as a first topic, I think you want to do some getting to know you type activities that you would do in a classroom as well. In a class, your students will be getting to know each other as well as you, maybe. But in a one-to-one setting, you're getting to know each other as your teacher-student dynamic. So I would do similar kind of activities there. And it's a much more fluent and much more conversational way to start off the lessons. And this can be contextualized into business English. It could be a more exam orientated, for example, depending on the needs of your student. But that's what I would do. And of course, the first lesson goes a long way to helping assess the level of your students. So that first lesson is really important. Great question. Thank you, Natalia. Let's see what else we've got here. So it's just a quick question from Sandiel. I hope I've got that pronunciation out. When will the webinars end and when do you start with exams and doing assignments? Check out some of the other videos we've got on our YouTube channel for that one. It's not really the focus of today, but I wanted to include that to orientate people towards some of the other webinars that we've recorded and are up on the channel on YouTube at the moment, and check those out. Let's see if there are any more questions. Mena says, any suggestions for the activities for me to try during the one-to-one class? Since it's a bit challenging, yeah, to make the lessons exciting, and I feel that I talk a lot, which must be boring for the student. Okay, well, maybe they're not finding it as boring as you think. They're listening intently at your pronunciation, your correct modeling of pronunciation. But any suggestions for activities? Yeah, the kind of, as I mentioned, the getting to know you activities, questionnaires, looking at certain texts and discussing that together. Um, the kind of questions about what things they like to do in their spare time, in their free time, about their habits and routine. So all of those general kind of activities that you might want to try to make it more exciting. Tap into what your student finds exciting, and maybe what you find interesting as well. If you're not that interested in the material, you're not going to be able to get that across, that kind of excitement and that intensity and interest across to your students. If you're not that interested in the topic yourself, I mean, obviously you want to reflect, to be aware and accommodate what your student likes to talk about as well, what they're interested in, and then find if you don't know much about it, you can find out something about that topic as well. So it's all good really. But I would find out what your student is interested in and work with that to make it more interesting for them. Here's another question from Sonia. If you finish this course, do you guys help us get students, or Miss Do are on our own? Well, that's a kind of a question that's it's not really specific for one-to-one teaching. I think we're talking about getting your own students here, and the best way to do that is to be somewhat proactive. Go out and find your own students. Advertise. You can use Gumtree, social media, of course. You can set up your own website, and you can find your students that way. Word of mouth also helps to a great extent as well. And once you've got students, you can help. That can help you find new students as well. You can incentivize your existing students to help you find other students as well. Do I need to take in account the mood of my students once a classroom to change the plan of prepared lesson, to please his or her demands? Yes, That's a great question. So I think in any kind of teaching context, one-to-one especially, because it's more focused, you need to pick up and see if that lesson that you've planned is going in the right direction. And don't be afraid to change course the direction of the lesson. If it's something is not really working, you can pick up on that, change it, do something else a bit more engaging, and then you can set the pace and set the interest of your lesson. But yeah, sometimes our students are going to be tired if they've had a long day at work, and they need something a bit more stimulating in their lesson. So what you've planned might necessarily be the best way to go in that particular lesson. You might say, okay, that's a bit intense tonight. I think maybe we'll come back to that another day, and let's do something else instead. So coming back to our being prepared for our lessons, have a plan B, have a range of different things and activities you can do in your class for different levels of energy. We talked about before having stirrers and settlers activities in the classroom to raise and lower the energy levels, and that's the same in one-to-one, I would say. So bear that in mind. Have a range of different things you can do in your lesson to reflect the mood or the energy of your students. Okay, here's just a quick comment from Never Again. Thank you so much for the information given. You're very welcome, everybody. So we're just coming up to the end now. So if you've got any more questions, now's the time. We've got a few more minutes left. Drop in your questions there or comments. I hope you found today useful. Hopefully you can find this recording up on YouTube along with the other webinars up there. And yeah, if you do do one-to-one teaching, I'm sure you're going to find it very rewarding and enjoyable. Whoops. Should we invest in textbooks or online courses? Wow, I think it doesn't hurt to source a good textbook, whether that's a student book or a teacher's book or a book about methodology. There are lots of great books out there specifically about one-to-one teaching and some good courses as well. Um, you can, if you feel that is going to be useful, for sure, yeah, you're investing in yourself after all. There's also lots of free resources out there as well, but I would definitely recommend investing in yourself as well, especially for one-to-one teaching, because it is quite different to normal classroom teaching. So I would definitely think about investing in yourself like that. Um, Here's a question. I found practicing with friends on one-to-one has helped me for time management and boundaries can be difficult for this type of student. What lesson plan type do you use to help with boundaries? Well, I don't think there's anything especially tailored in terms of a lesson plan template for managing boundaries. I think there's something you're going to have to ascertain for yourself during your one-to-one teaching when you get to know your students a bit better, and you can set the boundaries and set the rapport with your students. But definitely practicing on your friends is definitely a good way to build up that confidence as well and build up your experience. Definitely. Here's a comment from Natalia. Thank you for the informative webinar. Thank you. It's my pleasure. And Cynthia, pleasant class. Thank you. That's a very nice comment. Thank you. Okay, I think that's a good time to leave it now. So before I leave you, I want to just say thank you very much. And as always, your feedback is very much appreciated. So if you can follow the link and fill out the survey, that will be very, very helpful for us as we go forward to improve these webinars. Let us know what you think. Is there anything else that you would like us to cover during these live webinars? Okay, well, that's everything from me today. I hope that you found the webinar interesting and informative. So I'll say good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are, and thanks very much for listening. Bye bye.